Assalamu alaikum, dear friends. Welcome back to the third episode of the Israeliyat in Islamic history. This series is based off the work of Sheikh Ahmad Salman in his book, The Black Box of Islamic History. Now, we are going to continue our exploration of the hidden influences that shaped our Islamic history. In the previous episodes, we uncovered some of the fascinating threads about how Jewish scholars and converts influenced the early Islamic thought. And today we're diving into perhaps one of the most important and transformative periods in Islamic history, and that was the rise of the Umayyad dynasty and the fascinating characters who shaped Islamic thought during this crucial time. But before we begin and venture into the courts of Damascus and see what was happening, I want to address an interesting counterpoint that Sheikh Ahmad opens up with in this discussion. You see, when scholars talk about Jewish influence in early Islamic history, some inevitable questions that you might receive is, what about a character by the name of Abdullah ibn Saba? Wasn't he a Jewish convert? And people usually attribute him to the founder of Shia Islam. You know, he is the one that influenced Shia Islam. And it's a fascinating question, and it shows how, you know, historical narratives can be used to deflect attention from some of the more important and significant influences in Islamic history. As in, we've spoken about Humayr, we've spoken about Ka'b al-Ahbar, and we know that their impact, but to shadow their impact and to put their impact in the corner where no one can see, you would see in history that some characters would come to light, like Abdullah ibn Saba. And whilst he was a historical figure who caused some unrest during the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib, his actual influence was very limited. You know, think of him as a minor player who led a very small group, perhaps maybe 50 or 60 people at most. But his story magnified over time. And, you know, one of the possibilities is because it was to divert attention from more significant influences that we've discussed, as I mentioned, you know, Humran and Ka'b al-Ahbar. But what makes this particularly interesting is the contrast between Ibn Saba's actual historical footprint and how he's portrayed in the later accounts. Because whilst he's often painted as this massive influence on Shia theology and Shia school of thought, you won't find a single hadith which is attributed to him in any Shia book. No praise, no glorification, nothing. And if you were to compare this to how figures like Ka'b al-Ahbar were, you know, extensively quoted and praised in, you know, Sunni sources, you start to see a pattern emerging. Now, this brings us to a crucial concept in understanding these historical narratives. And this is what modern Israeli media analysts would call the counter-narrative strategy. And it's like a magician's trick. While you're focused on one hand, the real action is actually happening behind the scenes and in the other hand. In this case, while people were busy defeating and debating Abdullah ibn Saba and what did he do and what did he say, more influential figures were reshaping Islamic thought in ways that would last for centuries. And this is what brings us to the heart of our talk today and the story today. And that is the Umayyad court in Damascus, where some of the most fascinating and impactful chapters of Islamic history were written. You know, imagine a court where the Christian advisors, and this is the Islamic caliphate, but the Christian advisors were the ones who were whispering in the ears of the Muslim rulers, where ancient Jewish traditions were weaving themselves into the Islamic narratives, and where decisions were made that would shape the future of the Muslim world. All that was happening at the Umayyad court in Damascus. But before we begin and we step into these halls, let's set the stage by understanding how the Islamic Ummah got here. Now, I'm going to try and narrate this so you can sort of visualize and picture yourself there. I want you to picture yourself in Damascus during the height of the Khilafah of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. You know, the height of the Umayyad dynasty. But I want you to forget what you might imagine about, you know, what the Islamic capital looks like. Because the Damascus that we're going to explore right now, and the image that I'm going to put, is going to surprise many of you, especially the modern day Muslim who has some image of the early Islamic era. Because Damascus wasn't just another Arab city that was ruled by Muslims. It was something that was far more complex, far more fascinating. Imagine walking through the corridors of power in the Umayyad court, and the language you hear. You would probably be expecting to be hearing Arabic, right? No, there was no Arabic. The main language was Syriac. It was an ancient Christian language. And the official guards that are riding past you, you might think these are going to be Muslim guards. No, the guards in the court were also Christian. The influential advisors that were meeting with the caliph were also Christian. Like even the court physician and the caliph's favorite poet were Christian. And this wasn't just a matter of having, knowing a few people that weren't Muslim. The whole entire atmosphere of the court was steeped in Christian influences. So it sort of transitioned from early Jewish influence, and then as Muawiyah came into power, you started to see the Christian influence enter. And we're going to emphasize this a lot in today's talk. But here's where it gets really interesting. Do you know the coins back in those days? In the time of Muawiyah, where he had coins in the marketplace. You know how they would have prints on it? Many of these coins would have the image of Muawiyah holding a cross. And even today, you will still find archaeological proof of this. And it's weird. Why would Muawiyah be holding a cross? Right? The first Umayyad caliph was depicted on coins with a Christian symbol. And this is supposed to be, supposedly, a Muslim ruler or a Muslim caliph. And it's, historical records even suggest that Muawiyah occasionally participated in Christian ceremonies in Jerusalem. Now, you might be wondering, how did this happen? How did the capital of the Islamic Empire become so influenced by Christian culture? And the answer lies in understanding what the Syrian region really was at the time. Think of it less as a conquered Muslim territory and more as, what modern political scientists might call a semi-autonomous region. It was like almost a federal state that maintained strong cultural and political ties with the Byzantine Empire while being part of the Muslim world. And this unique situation created something, you could say, remarkable. But the most fascinating part of this story centers around two men. You may have heard of these two men. The first is the advisor and the right-hand man of Muawiyah, whose name was Sir John, and his son, who would become known to history as John of Damascus. Now, Sir John wasn't just any advisor. He was the chief administrator for Muawiyah. He had so much power and influence over the governance of the empire. If you wanted to think of him, as something today between a modern day prime minister and, someone who has executive decisions in a government, right? His influence was so profound that when critical decisions needed to be made, like appointing governors or making huge, major political moves, it was often Sir John's counsel that would come up first. And perhaps the most significant impact on Islamic history came through his son, whose name was Yusha, and we'll go more into him in a moment. Because imagine growing up in the Umayyad court, right? The son of Sir John was brought up, now he's a Christian obviously, brought up in the caliphate, the courtyard of the Islamic caliphate, and he was absorbing both the Christian theology and the Islamic thought from an early age. Now, this was unique because it would enable him to become something that was unprecedented. He would be, the son of Sir John, would be the first person to systematically analyze and criticize Islamic theology from a Christian perspective. Imagine this, the first book, the first publication that was written to attack and to scrutinize Islam from within was produced in the courtyard and in the house and in the home of the Muslim caliph. And this was a huge move. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating paradoxes in Islamic history. Because the first theological critique of Islam didn't come from a distant opponent or from someone in the Byzantine Empire or someone, far away, someone emerged from within the heart and the center of Islamic power. And he would write, John of Damascus would write what he called the heresy of the Ismailiyat, or the Ishmaelites. And, this would be the first systematic engagement with Islam from an outside perspective. And it was there to try and annihilate the Islamic rulings. But the story doesn't end there. Because the influence of these advisors, these Christian advisors, would extend far beyond the political administration. They would help. It's like they took over the Jewish plan. They would help shape Islamic theological concepts and ideas and thought in ways that would last for centuries. They would introduce ideas about divine attributes, free will versus predestination, the nature of the religious authority that would become central to Islamic theological debates. And yet this Christian influence was just one part of a large, really complicated picture. Because remember how I was just mentioning the Jewish influences that we had discussed in previous episodes? Well, they didn't go away. They were just about to intersect with the Christian influence court in ways that would fundamentally reshape Islamic thought. And I want to explore how these political and cultural influences transformed into religious ideas that would shape Islamic thought for centuries. And at the center of this transformation, we find characters like Wahab ibn Munabbih. Picture this. It's the late 7th century and the Umayyad Empire is at its peak. In Yemen, a scholar emerges who would become one of the most influential storytellers in Islamic history. Wahab ibn Munabbih was born to a Jewish father, and like many of the figures we've discussed in these past 3 episodes, he came from a family steeped in Jewish religious tradition. But what made Wahab different was his extraordinary ability to bring together religious narratives in ways that would captivate audience for generations. Basically, he was a great storyteller. Think of Wahab as something like a medieval religious Netflix showrunner, right? He took the brief mentions of prophets in the Quran and what he had learned in his Jewish tradition, and he would transform them into elaborate, detailed stories. And if you've ever heard dramatic tales about biblical prophets in Islamic tradition, like the kind of stories that would go far beyond what the Quran mentions, then there's a good chance that these stories originated with or were popularized by Wahab ibn Munabbih. The Quran God purposely does not share specific details of stories of prophets. He tells us in the story what we need. Whereas Wahab ibn Munabbih would, we mentioned in previous episodes, he would capitalize on the imagination and the creative and the storytelling, the need for storytelling and understanding stories by the Arabs, and he'd utilize that in his propagation. In fact, it's estimated that almost 70 to 80% of the elaborate prophetic stories that made their way into Islamic tradition came through him. And these weren't just simple stories. They were carefully crafted narratives that blended elements from Jewish tradition, Christian tradition, and early Islamic sources. And here's the crucial part. These stories weren't presented as entertainment or foreign traditions. They were gradually absorbed into mainstream Islamic religious culture. And people started to see this as part of religion. But Wahab's influence was just one piece of a large transformation happening in Damascus. Remember, the son of Sir John that we mentioned, his contribution to Islamic theology was even more profound. Although it might be less obvious at first glance. Because through his writings and influence in the Umayyad court, several key theological concepts began to take shape. For example, one was the idea of divine predestination, or in Arabic is jabr. This wasn't just an abstract theological concept. It had profound and deep political implications. After all, if everything is predestined by God, including who holds power, then challenging the ruling authority becomes not just a political act, but a rebellion against God's will, because God has ordained for this person to hold power. See its impact? Like another concept that emerges during this period was irja', or the doctrine of postponement. This idea that judgment about someone's faith should be postponed to the afterlife. Now, while this might sound like a call for, being a tolerant or a religious tolerance, but it also served a political purpose. It meant that the moral or religious conduct of rulers shouldn't be questioned by their subject. You just have to wait. And judgment about his or her faith will be postponed. These concepts, these theological concepts, weren't developed in a vacuum. They emerged in the unique environment of the Umayyad court, where Christian theological ideas, Jewish religious narratives, and political necessities all intersected. And the result was a religious framework that would become deeply embedded in mainstream Islamic thought. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was yet to come, because for nearly 90 years after the Prophet's death, there had been no official compilation of his sayings, of his traditions. And the preservation of these traditions had largely been left to memory and oral transmission. This was about to change in a way that would permanently shape Islamic religious thought for centuries to come. Now we come to perhaps the most consequential development of this entire period, and one that would, shape Islamic thought for all these generations to come. Imagine for a moment what it means to preserve the teachings and sayings of a religious figure. Today we're used to instant documentation. Everything is recorded, archived, and backed up. We've got the cloud, we've got drives, we've got, so many ways to store our information. But in the early Islamic period, things were very different. For 89 years after the Prophet's death, nearly 3 generations, there was no official compilation of his sayings and traditions. Because as we mentioned, from the time of the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, until Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, almost a century later, the documentation of hadith was largely forbidden. And that means that 3 generations of Muslims grew up without access to written records of the Prophet's sayings. And during this time, figures like Ka'b al-Ahbar, Wahab ibn Munabbih, Humran ibn Aban, and others introduced their own narratives. And as we mentioned, many of these were based on the Jewish and Christian sources. But when Umar ibn Abdul Aziz lifted the ban on documenting hadith, it was seen as a significant step forward, and he was seen as this reformer. But Sheikh Ahmad Salman explains that this move, while positive on the surface, was a strategic move. There was a strategy behind lifting the ban. When Umar ibn Abdul Aziz ordered the documentation of hadith, Sheikh Ahmad says he assigned individuals who had been influenced by the prevailing narratives of their time. Figures who had absorbed the ideas introduced by the likes of Ka'b and Wahab. And this meant that the hadith being recorded weren't just the sayings of the Prophet, but they included narratives that had been shaped by external influences. And we know in history that Muawiyah had paid lots of money for narrators to change names in original stories and hadiths and narrations and sayings of the Prophet that can suit their agenda. And Sheikh Ahmad Salman describes how this process led to the creation of what he calls contaminated compilations. While many authentic hadith were preserved, but they were interwoven with stories and ideas that had no basis in Islam. And these additions, Sheikh Ahmad says and argues, that were not mistakes. Oh no, they were part of a deliberate effort to reshape Islamic thought. And one of the key figures in this process, as we mentioned, is Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, right, who played a major role in compiling the hadith under the directive of the Umayyad Caliphate. And Sheikh Ahmad Salman explains that while al-Zuhri's work was groundbreaking, it was also deeply influenced by the political and cultural environment of Banu Umayyah. And under the Umayyads, the compilation of hadith was strategy and only strategy. It wasn't about preserving the words of the Prophet or Islam. It was about creating a narrative that would align with their rule and their rule to come. They needed a version of Islam that justified their behavior, that justified their actions and that silenced their critics. And this is why we see so many hadith that emphasize the obedience to rulers, even tyrannical rulers. These weren't words of the Prophet. They were words of those in power. We've probably heard that hadith or that narration where even if your ruler is corrupt, you are not allowed to stand against him, because standing against him means it's going to cause bloodshed. This is all stuff that is contradictory to what the Prophet came and taught. And the result of this process, Sheikh Ahmad Salman says, was a body of literature and hadith that mixed truth with fabrication. And while scholars over the centuries have worked tirelessly to authenticate these narrations, to sift through the right from wrong, the truth from the falsehood, the presence of fabricated hadith till today remains a challenge, particularly for those who are trying to understand Islam in its purest form. And this contamination of hadith, according to Sheikh Ahmad Salman, highlights the importance of returning to the Quran and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet. Because whilst all this is going on, people still need a reliable source of guidance. And he emphasized that the Islamic tradition, the authentic narration, the authentic teachings of Islam was exclusively preserved by the family of the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt. Exclusively. Even during the times of widespread distortion. The family of the Prophet, the sons of Imam Ali and Sayyidah Fatima, were the guardians of his teachings. And whilst others were introducing these external ideas, the Ahlul Bayt upheld the truth. And this was why they were persecuted. And this is why they were overshadowed and they were put in this, imprisoned and killed and poisoned. This is why, because they were the ones that were ensuring that the authenticity of the narrations and the sayings of the Prophet would remain intact. And this is why their role is central to understanding Islam in its original form. It's not a political choice. It's the Ahlul Bayt were the only ones that had the true knowledge of Islam. Everything else was all over the place. There was too much fabrication and too much external agendas being mixed with the Islamic thought. Now, while the official channels of hadith documentation were closed for those 89 years, there were others who never stopped writing. And let me tell you about someone who you might have not heard of before. And you might have. His name is Sulaym ibn Qais al-Hilali. Now, he was one of the first people to document Islamic history, writing about crucial events like what happened at the gathering of Saqifa after the Prophet passed away, or when he was on his deathbed even. But his story reveals just how dangerous that documentation could be in those early years. Sulaym spent most of his life as a fugitive. He was pursued by authorities until his death during the time of Al-Hajjaj. Now, he wasn't wanted for participating in rebellions or for some major crime. His only offense was because he was narrating and writing down history. Think about that for a moment. What does it tell us when the simple act of recording history makes you a fugitive and a wanted man? But Sulaym was not alone. There was other people. Abu Rafi', which was a freed slave from the Holy Prophet. He wrote a book about religious rulings and principles. His son documented who fought alongside Ali in Siffin. And these weren't just random scribblings, they were systematic attempts to preserve knowledge. And this brings us to a crucial point. While the official narrative was being shaped in Damascus, alternative documentations were being maintained, particularly by the Ahlul Bayt and their followers. And this is why the period of official hadith compilation under Umar ibn Abdul Aziz wasn't just about preserving knowledge. It was about controlling the narrative. Because people still wanted to know what was going on in Islam. What was Islam? What was the Prophet teaching us? It's been 3 generations. And the only ones that were actually giving us these answers were the Ahlul Bayt, who contradict the narrative of the rulers. So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz had to control that narrative, in his opinion. And it's similar to what modern day scholars call institutional memory. Whoever controls the official records shapes how history is remembered. And we know so much of how this is happening today with what is unfolding in the Middle East. And how when you have control over the media, you can control the narrative and what people believe and what people think. And the consequences of this period are still with us today. When you pick up any traditional book of Islamic history or law, you're not just reading historical facts, you're reading the end product of this fascinating and complex process. There's stories about the prophets that feel so familiar to Muslims today. Many of them can be traced to Wahab ibn Munabbih. Those theological concepts about predestination and, what's the point of working hard? My rizq, my sustenance is written for me. There's no point, this person is written for me. I'm going to die on, so-and-so. God's written the day I'm going to die. There's no point of being healthy. They emerged from the Christian-influenced Umayyad court. But perhaps the most significant legacy is something even more subtle. There was an Egyptian scholar who we may have mentioned before, who found extensive parallels and connections between the historical works of Al-Tabari and some of the Jewish sources. She discovered that a large portion of what became accepted Islamic history was actually lifted word for word from Jewish and Christian sources. And this wasn't just a matter of, similar stories. We're talking word for word translations presented as authentic Islamic tradition. So what does this mean for us today? It doesn't invalidate Islamic tradition. Far from it, no. Rather, what it does is it shows us something profound about how the religious tradition would evolve and interact. It reminds us that history is never as simple as we might like it to be. The pure tradition we sometimes imagine existing in the past was always more complex. It was more nuanced, and it was more interconnected than we might assume. Now, as we conclude today's episode, I want you to think about those parallels that we still grapple with, questions we still grapple with around authority, authenticity, about the relationship between, political power and religious narrative. Who gets to tell our stories? Who gets to define our traditions? These aren't just historical questions. They're questions that we're going to continue to face, even in our own time. And hopefully in the next episode, we'll be finalizing and concluding this adventure into early Islamic history and trying to unfold the development of the Islamic thought in the past centuries. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this video valuable. And if you did, feel free to like it, comment if you have any questions, share it around so other people can find value. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace be upon you, my friend.